It's time to talk about this. Code Vein is a Souls-like action RPG with a flexible stat system, decent combat, a very anime story that I expect to see on Adult Swim at 1 in the morning, and very lackluster DLC. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Code Vein in broad strokes. Now for the finer details. And before we get into that, let me first explain what I mean. Broad strokes is a series idea that I had way back about 3 years ago. First, initially for Deep Rock Galactic. The idea is that I give you a synopsis of the entire video right from the bat and the general idea I have of it. Then, go into detail over each individual point. In this particular case, we will be going over the stat system, which is a part of the UI, the combat system, the story, and then the DLC. Let's get into it. Starting with the UI, this is a lot to take in, but it's actually quite simple once you understand it. Starting at the bottom, we have your item bar. This is where your healing, your stat removal, and your get out of jail free cards all exist at. You can use them by pressing left and right on your D-pad, and then down to actually use the item. On the very top is your armor and 2 weapons. Unlike the other Soulsborne games, you do not have 4 armor slots, you just have 1. Your weapons come in 5 classes, and we'll get into them later, but your armor determines your backstab strength, your special attack strength, and your spell strength. It also determines your armor stats, but don't mind them too much. On the left side is your passives, which, if you play Dark Souls, are equivalent to your rings. These provide you passive buffs, such as health, stamina, regeneration, and stat immunities. They can be equipped at any time, but with a special requirement. Lastly, on the right is your spells. You can have 8 at a time, and you can use any of them without having to flip through. It is a much easier system that I will explain in the next segment. In the middle here is your blood codes. This is the central gimmick of the game. Blood codes determine your stats, and allow you to unlock more rings and spells. They are how you actually progress through that system, and in order to be able to use more spells on different blood codes, you have to master them, either by having them equipped and killing a lot of enemies, or else using the level up material that is found throughout the world, or by farming from certain areas and enemies. Next is the combat system. There's not much to say about it. It's really the same as Dark Souls, with your heavy attacks and light attacks, but there are 3 things I would like to talk about. Specifically, the bayonet, which is a new class of weapon introduced in this game, how spells work, and key bindings. Starting with the bayonet, it's a new option that has both a melee and a range capability. Your heavy attack is your range, which uses your magic in order to be able to shoot a bullet. You're going to have to go in for melee in order to restore it. It is the centerpiece of a lot of one-shot builds. If you're struggling with a certain boss, go online and look for one-shot builds. You'll probably find a bayonet paired with most of them. Next on the roster is spells. In order to use spells, you need to hold the right trigger, and then, as you see, you can use any direction on the D-pad or any of the lettered buttons in order to be able to actually use spells. They use up your I-core, but they are incredibly strong. The fact that you can buff and use any attack very quickly in succession, provided you have enough actual mana, which restores on hit, you can do some serious damage, and spellcraft is part of the central mechanic to this game. Last but not least, keybinds. This is a problem area I have with this game, because Dark Souls has the attack buttons bound to right bumper, right trigger. Monster Hunter, which is the only other game I have a problem with in regards to how it feels compared, has Y and B as its attack buttons. This game uses X and Y, so it breaks both of those mentalities entirely. And not to mention, you cannot rebind them. They are bound to those buttons, and if you tried to set it to, say, Dark Souls 1, you would have to figure out a new combination in order to be able to use spells, because remember, you have to hold right trigger in order to be able to actually use them. Now, I'm not opposed to some new binding, but frankly, my entire idea with this is just get used to it. If you have a better key binding, then by all means use it. The story is decent. There's not much I can say about it. It generally follows the same sort of plot line as Dark Souls. You have a big bad at the very end and 4 lords in order to contend with. The context of it this time is a lot different, and frankly, it's told a lot better than Dark Souls, I would say. Mostly because, as I said, this storyline feels like it should show up on Adult Swim at some point at night. But that's just my own opinion. As far as the actual world itself goes and the world building, it's pretty decent. The world building is built around the vestige system, which is how you unlock more blood codes. As opposed to just having them, you have to revisit memories of our people and see the experiences of the world through their eyes, which is a very interesting way of being able to build up how the situation is around you without actually having you see it for yourself. You instead learn more about characters, such as Yakumo, who places a great deal of value on friendship, but as you learn later, that is because he lost everyone he had called his family in the face of the game's main antagonist. You have Louis, who is very quick to help others, but as you learn through these memories, it has led to this entire situation happening in the first place because he couldn't follow along with helping someone, and has led to someone being killed for trying to be as helpful as he was. And of course, you have the people you think are antagonists. Jack, one of the antagonists, is simply following orders and trying to help maintain the status quo. Gregorio Silva, who is, I'm just going to spoil it, the final boss of the game, has placed a heavy tax on everyone in order to get a lot of blood. The reasoning behind this, of course, is to protect everyone from threats outside of the Jail of the Mists, a barrier separating this place from the outside world. The reasoning behind that, of course, is revealed later, and this game does something that I actually quite like. It shows the primary antagonist far earlier than the end of the game. Specifically, if this were Dark Souls 3, the final antagonist would have been Aldrich, as opposed to Lothric, or the Lord of Cinder. Regardless, the storyline is comprehensible, and actually has some enjoyment, as you get attached to the characters and learn more about them. Overall, though, you'll end up probably playing this for the gameplay as opposed to the story. If you're doing that, I would still recommend playing Dark Souls instead. And now, for the biggest thorn in this game's side, the DLC. There are 5 DLC available for this game on Steam, 3 of which are the actual gameplay-based DLCs, such as, say, Ring City and Ashes of Ariandel for Dark Souls 3. These essentially add Chalice dungeons to your game, but the only twist on that is that these Chalice dungeons are deeply shit. You see, the Chalice dungeons themselves are for the most part optional. You have no reason to go through and complete them, because they are simply there to be filler for the main content of the DLC. That main content being the boss. Each of the DLCs has a boss enemy that ranges from about average to incredibly strong, and has a list of challenges that you can complete for items. This is the main point of the DLC and its weakest point in general. In order to get your money's worth out of the DLC, you need to face the challenges that are presented before you, earning the items and being able to actually get what the DLC is trying to give you. This is a lackluster system. There's of course the standard defeat. There is survive for 5 minutes, get 50 attacks in a row without being hit once, evade 10 times in a row, deal copious amounts of damage, get a parry, defeat using specific weapons, and then fight using specific blood codes or allies. which nets you either cosmetic changes to your allies, cosmetic changes to yourself, or occasionally items, such as the Hellfire Pipe for killing the boss with the weakest weapon in the game. Good luck. And then after that, you have the difficulty slider challenges, which ranges up to +10. The +10 version being equivalent to a New Game +7. And the reason why the DLC is so weak, in my eyes, is because the boss scales up with New Game Plus. And the difficulty slider isn't limited to just New Game +7. This means if you try and do these challenges, these DLCs on New Game +7, you would be fighting what is more or less essentially equivalent to a New Game +14 enemy if it continued to scale. These bosses are not fair in that regard. These challenges are not fair in that regard. The only thing I would have to say is find a one-shot build and try to get as many challenges done as you can on your new game run. Because otherwise you're facing more health, more attack, more difficulty with each New Game Plus run you do. Thankfully, as far as I can tell, you would only need to actually complete them once per character, and I'm unsure if the challenges reset every New Game Plus you go up. If they do, man, that shit's so not worth it. Overall, my verdict of Code Vein is that it is a very good game with a decent story and generally Dark Souls-esque combat with a heavy focus on spellcraft. It is held back by the DLC, but so long as you ignore them or else go out of your way to find ways to actually beat it rather easily, it is not too much of a downer. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Highlain Prison River. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.